Thank you so much. So I don't like lecturing, so I'll call this a talk, and I haven't rehearsed it. That way, it's flows naturally and maybe at times stuntedly because I lose my train of thought. Anyway, what I'd like to talk about today is Dusti Bongé, Walter Anderson, and sort of the creative alliances that existed along the coast, mostly, of course, between New Orleans and Ocean Springs and Biloxi, but bit of larger Louisiana and Mississippi inherently, just because they all traveled and took trips and went out into the country and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, of course, first let's introduce our artists in case you don't know them. So Dusti Bongé was actually born Eunice Lyle Sweatman, and she was born in Biloxi. And of course, Walter Inglis Anderson, also known as Bob, because his father's name was George Walter and went by Walter, so Walter Inglis went by Bob. So that's how that story goes. But before they came into the picture on the coast, there were a few fairly famous characters on the scene, and starting in the 1870s, 1880s. There was William Woodward, who was a painter, but also taught architecture. There was his younger brother, Ellsworth Woodward, who was also a painter. And then, of course, there was George Ohr, the Mad Potter of Biloxi. And as you can kind of see there, they're all from the same generation, 1859, 1861, 1857. The Woodwards were from Massachusetts, and they moved to the New Orleans in the 1880s. And George Ohr was from a German family that had moved to Biloxi, so he was born and raised in Biloxi. And these are, obviously, the portrait of William is by his brother Ellsworth. Ellsworth's portrait is a self-portrait, and George Ohr was a portrait by somebody here locally who drew him, which I think is fantastic. I'd never seen it before. I like visuals. So the Woodwards were very, very, very active in the New Orleans art world. They really kind of wanted to bring a higher quality of fine art, excuse me, to the South. Because, at the time in the 1870s, 1880s, the art centers were mostly on the East Coast, and they felt like, even though they weren't from here originally, they were like, wouldn't it be nice if we can really get people there excited about, the arts and the fact that anybody can pursue them, So William Woodward helped found Newcomb College at Tulane in the 1880s. Within a few years of teaching there and moving there, he made his first visit to Ocean Springs, and then he came back many, many, many times. So he really loved it. Eventually, he actually moved to Biloxi. Ellsworth Woodward teaches at Newcomb College and establishes Newcomb pottery specifically. So, he's quite busy too, and he, of course, also appreciates the nature all around the coast, Louisiana, the swamps, all of that. And George Ohr, as you all know, is a master in clay, and he, in the 1870s, apprenticed with Joseph Meyer, and Joseph Meyer was another potter in New Orleans. So, and Joseph Meyer knew the Woodwards. So already you start to see alliances clicking, right? And George Ohr in 1884, I think he submitted something like 600 pieces of pottery to a world convention in New Orleans. I mean, he was busy, like the Energizer Bunny. He just kept going and going and going. when William Woodward, as he kept traveling more and more here, he would start painting these sort of coastal scenes of the seafood industry along the back bay of Biloxi and areas like that. Um, Around that time, also within a few years, he opened yet another pottery, which was called the New Orleans Art Pottery. And Ellsworth Woodward is also part of that. And George Ohr winds up working at the New Orleans Art Pottery. So all these connections are starting to firm up. You know, they all know each other, they all support each other, they all learn from each other, and occasionally are probably envious of one another, if I had to guess. You know, humans being what they are. Then in 1923, William Woodward actually moves to Biloxi, and he establishes something called the Mississippi Gulf Coast Art Association. Ellsworth Woodward stays in New Orleans, but he is very, very active in advocating for Southern arts and making sure that arts from the South get noticed in the larger country. You know, that it's like, hey, we can do this down here too. You know, we're not just a bunch of fishermen and, you know, cotton brokers. And of course, George continues to create his just astounding pieces, you know, that nobody had ever seen before. I mean, he was so ahead of his time. It's uncanny. Even nowadays, you rarely see stuff like this. So that tells you something, just how talented he was. And so then we get to sort of the same generation, but the families. So Dusty's father was known as O.G. Sweatman, because Orstenith is a mouthful. So everybody called him O.G. And Walter's father was George Walter Anderson, known as Walter, hence Bob. Anyway, so they're, you know, in the same age range. As you can see, both very sophisticated gentlemen, with a slightly stern appearance, which apparently bode well for the children insofar as getting them to do something. And then you have Dusty's mother, whose name was also Eunice Lyle Sweatman, and Annette McConnell Anderson, Walter's mother. And again, these look like women who rule their roost. You know, they're not, I don't think they got walked over by their kids. I think they knew how to keep them in line. And Dusty's mother has roots directly in Louisiana, and Annette McConnell has roots directly in Louisiana. And I think Walter's father had roots in Louisiana as well. So you start to see that the families that eventually all wind up here all had sort of the Southern plantation-related, you know, roots, which is okay. You know, it's part of history. What is kind of funny, though, is that the families move at different stages. Dusty's grandparents moved from New Orleans, and Walter's parents moved here, and quite a bit apart in the 1880s and then 1920s, respectively. But what was kind of funny is that Dusty's grandfather was a cotton broker, and that's what the cotton brokerage in New Orleans looked like in the 1880s. And Walter's father was a cotton broker as well. And this is what it looked like in the early 1920s with all the funny little hats that they're wearing. You know, very, this, you know, you can tell it's a different atmosphere, but they're doing the same thing, you know. And it's kind of like Wall Street for cotton. So I'm sure there was a lot of yelling and screaming going on, even though they were such distinguished gentlemen. So then you have the families. And now we get to, of course, the kids. Dusty was born in 1903. Walter was born in 1903. She was born in Biloxi. He was born in New Orleans. She's the youngest of three. He's the middle of three. And she grew up on Biloxi Beach in a very nice house. You know, they were a comfortable family. Her father was a banker. Her grandfather was the cotton broker, and her father became a banker. And Walter grew up in the New Orleans Garden District, which is also not too shabby. If you've ever been there, there's some really nice homes there. So they had a good upbringing. They had, again, you know, they had mothers who really cared about them getting an education and all of that. And Dusti was allowed as a young girl. At the time, she wasn't doing fine art or painting yet, but she really liked to act. And so she was allowed to stage little plays in their front porch that people would come to, and they'd pay a nickel, I think, you know. So that was all encouraged. And of course, Annette totally encouraged all three of the boys, Walter and Mac and Peter, to be creative from a very early age on. So that greatly worked in their favor, and they eventually all grew up to show that. Now we're going to make a little jump again. So they've grown up, and now we are looking at some young people who are venturing out into the world. And you see a name here that you might be, who is that? Archie Bongé was Dusti Bongé's husband. Paul Ninas was another artist who lives in New Orleans, and I'll get back to him again. So this, I'm weaving because I kind of have to. Anyway, and these happen to all be self-portraits they did of themselves. Not quite at that time yet, but in the 1930s. So the story here is that, okay, so around 1919, Dusti goes to college. She goes to a four-year college called Blue Mountain College, which is in upstate Mississippi in the middle of nowhere. Her parents, she wanted to pursue a career in acting. Her parents were not looking upon that too favorably for a proper Southern young woman. So her mother made a pact with her and said, if you go to a four-year college first, then you can pursue whatever you want. So Dusti goes to college and finishes in 2.5 years. So, because she wants to get the hell out of here. She would, you know, she really wanted to go explore the world. So she attends Black Mountain College and finishes. Meanwhile, Archie Bongé, her future beau, attends the University of Nebraska to study art. And Archie there befriends a young man named Paul Ninas, who went to the University of Nebraska to study engineering. So obviously that went way off the rails. Then a couple of years later, Dusti moves to Chicago once she has finished her undergraduate, moves to Chicago to start pursuing art, acting. And she goes to the Lyceum there. And back then they had these things, Lyceums and the Chautauqua Circuit. They were these traveling troops of artists and educators, and they would go mostly by train to a lot of small towns to bring art and education to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. So they would travel through Kansas and you know, all these kinds of small towns. They would set up enormous tents, and actors would perform plays, and there would be music, and there might be some simple lectures about things. And Dusti wound up participating in that. Which must have been a hoot, I'm sure. But so when she gets to Chicago, she really starts to study acting, but she also participates in that sort of travel stuff. Meanwhile, Archie Bongé also moves to Chicago to study art there, and he meets Dusty, and they get along. They like each other, but she's a young, attractive, flirty woman. Not flirty in a bad way, but she was attractive. So hello, he wasn't the only one that was interested in her. But anyway, and Paul Ninas leaves the University of Nebraska, where he was with Archie, and no, he's still there for a little bit. Sorry, but then he leaves there, and he starts traveling extensively. I don't know much about his family, but he must have been from a very good family as well, because he travels in North Africa. He goes to Morocco and places like that, and then he goes to the Caribbean, to the Dominican Republic, and to Cuba, and it's just like, wow, you dropped engineering, and your parents are fine with you doing this. This must be what a life, what a fantastic life. So this is something he painted when he was on one of the Caribbean islands. And this, the photo of Dusty she's the tall one with, some of the troupe that she would perform with. And this is a very early still life that Arch Bongé did as he was studying. So that's one little connection we get there. But then, of course, there's also Dusty, Archie, and Walter. And here again, Archie is the major connector, which you might not expect, but you'll find out why. So Dusty eventually leaves Chicago, and she moves to New York to continue acting. And Arch Bongé, independently of Dusty, they didn't plan this at all, also moves to New York to continue studying art. He goes to the Art Student League in New York for a while. And Walter moves to New York to go study art. And Walter was taking classes at a place that's now known as Parsons. Back then, it had a different name, and it escapes me right now. But and so then Dusty stays in New York for several years, and she acts on stage, and she's about to kind of enter into the movie business when they had what they called the early talkies, when silent movies were just ending and they were able to, combine sound with video. So again, having a roaring time, I'm sure. Meanwhile, both Archie and Walter wind up moving to Philadelphia to pursue art at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And they become really good friends. And Walter actually plays a funny little role in their courtship, which, if John Anderson were here, I would let him tell you about it. But since he doesn't, he's not here, so I'll tell you about it. So what happens is that eventually, of course, Dusty and Archie reconnect, and they wind up getting married, and the rest is history, which we'll get to. But Walter, when he was in New York with Archie worked as a doorman to make a living. At a nice theater, he had to wear the whole sort of livery thing and open the door. And he was 6'6", so it must have been very impressive to see him wear, all that sort of regal stuff. And as him and Dusty reconnect, he really wants to start dating her again, and this time they get kind of serious about each other. And so Archie wants to take Dusty out, but in the evenings he works at the theater, because of course New York theater is in the evenings. So he asked Walter if he would please be doorman for him for one night so he can go on a date with Dusty. So Walter was what, 5'8" maybe? He wasn't very tall. Walter puts the 6'6" costume on, has to roll up everything, and he goes and plays doorman for a night so that Archie and Dusty can have a date. So I just think that's a lovely story. So yeah, and you could tell that that's a true friendship. You know what I mean? It's that means something. So eventually in 1928. Actually, they're mostly all of them done with their studies, and Walter actually comes back to the coast around that time, and Archie and Dusty get married here in Biloxi because her family is here, and Walter is best man at their wedding, and Walter gives them the most lovely gift, which is a vase he made for them. And that one is now known as the wedding vase. And it is in the exhibit over here. And you will see also a drawing next to it that Dusty did years later of the vase with a bouquet of flowers in it. Because she would just have it around the house on the table. And when she started becoming a painter, she would study everything in her house and everything around her. So so that's sort of the wedding vase is kind of seals the deal of the friendship. And it's, you know, it's just wonderful that it's still around. Dusty's grandson now owns it. But anyway, meanwhile, Dusty and Archie don't settle down here yet. They go back to New York, but they start making trips back and forth. But one night, Dusty and Archie had a kind of an argument, and then he has to go off to work. So she feels bad because she goes to work during the daytime. So as she tells it, I drew him a picture. And so her picture was this little vase on a table with flowers in it. It was the first thing she ever really drew. And he kind of liked it. And that's sort of the point at which he says, you know, you could probably do this too, right? So this is the first seed of her realizing that she could, you know, pursue something that's not acting. Anyway, so there's the happy wedding, and they go back to New York. But then they, you know, come back and forth a lot, and now Paul Ninas comes back into the picture again. Dusty winds up giving up acting in 1929 because she realizes she's expecting, and also because she's a very smart young woman, realizes that acting and having children, that sort of self-obsessed, being an actor, you know, might not work very well with being a responsible mother. So she gives up acting. So her and Archie come back and forth quite a bit. She actually comes back home to give birth to her son Lyle, you know, to be with her mother and all of that. But they travel back and forth, and she starts sketching a little bit. Archie, whenever he would come to the coast, he would do watercolors and paintings of the local scenes, again, very similar to what William Woodward and them were doing, which is, you know, just sort of appreciating the seafood scenery, you know, the whole, the industry and the boats and all of that. And Dusty goes with him and starts to do her own stuff. And Paul Ninas, meanwhile, has moved from traveling the world to, he settles down in New Orleans. So when Dusty and Archie come back down here to visit, they'll often take an excursion to New Orleans and visit with Paul Ninas. So Dusty gets to know Paul Ninas, and the bonds, you know, grow more. And still through all of this, Archie was the original connection between these people, which I think is very interesting. And you can see Paul Ninas too is doing similar scenes. You know, they're all kind of interested, but you can tell there's a modernist to the work that they are doing that you didn't see in the Woodwards work, right? It's sort of plainer, slightly cubist. They're trying to depict it without trying to be realistic about it. They're capturing the mood of it, and to some degree, I would say the messiness of it, right? Boats leaning over, blah, 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 masts, piers, whatever. So they are all doing that. Okay, where did my mouse go? Ah! Why don't I not see it on the screen? Oh, that's what happened. If I go too far off, it goes over there. That's pretty funny. Sorry. Yes, and it was gone over here. That's very funny. So, but of course, that as they're doing all their back and forth traveling, they're also reconnecting with Walter a lot, you know. You know, the Dusty tries to draw a little more. By now, their son Lyle is born, and she tries to do this funny little sketch of him. She was not very good at drawing humans yet at the time, but it's really cute. And she wrote, "Its hair is not red." So I think he actually was kind of a redhead, so, or certainly strawberry, you know. But anyway, I thought that was just really cute, and you can see it's all wrinkled up, and you know, she wasn't thinking she was creating an artwork there, but I kind of love it. But then Archie, as they go back and forth, he also still paints when he's in New York, and this is actually a scene of him looking out of the back window at their apartment in New York. They lived in Chelsea at the time, which of course back then, I'm sure was super affordable. As a young artist now, you do not live in Chelsea unless you have a really nice trust fund. And meanwhile, you know, Walter is now really settled down here, and he starts the annex at Shearwater Pottery with his brother Mac, so that they can start making what none of them were crazy about, but they all thought was necessary. They start making more mass-produced figurines. And of course, we're all happy that they did that, because many of us have collected them over the years. But what Walter really, truly wants in his heart is he wants to paint, you know. But he's quite adept at all the pottery as well. So they're all kind of pursuing art in their own way. Dusty then eventually, while she's raising Lyle, she starts to get a little more serious about sketching. And this is a very early work, and I think it's a very competent sketch of a flower, you know. It's I think it's a trumpet flower, and you can clearly see she's got skills, and I'm sure she's, you know, she's picking up from watching Archie, her husband, who is a professional painter, what to do, and I'm sure he gave her pointers on how to look at things, and you know, how to try to capture them without literally copying them. And meanwhile, Archie does this lovely portrait of its hair is not red, and I don't know, it's pretty close. It's not quite blonde, so, but I just think it's lovely how he captures him with his big blue eyes. And Walter settles in and marries Sissy, and he works at night on painting and making their own furniture and all of that, but during the day he's still at the annex. But this is a lovely portrait that he did of Sissy, which is just fabulous because she looks so relaxed. So they're all now really continuing to hone their skills. And I just thought this was kind of nice. As they settle down, the photo in the middle is the house where Archie and Dusty settled down in Biloxi. And the drawing by Dusty is her sitting in the studio that's behind their house, looking at the house and drawing the house. So when you look, you can see it. There's the tree that's growing through the roof. That tree is no longer there, but it was growing through the roof for a long, long time. And you can see it in her drawing as well, that the tree is coming through the roof. But you start to see here that she is really, really, really starting to do that thing that we saw Paul Ninas do as well, where you just kind of take these surfaces and put them next to each other, but you're not trying to get an accurate perspective or something like that, but you're still capturing it in 3 dimensions.
We call that Michelopolis.
Michelopolis, right, yes, yes. Okay, excellent, yeah. Right, yeah, and it's you know, some of that started because Paul Ninas, when he traveled so much, he spent time in Europe after traveling the world, and so he picks up very quickly a lot of what the sort of the Cubist stuff in Europe, and he's kind of the one that brings that to New Orleans, you know. So, but then I also love the sketch that Walter did of their cottage together, and this one is, I think, what is this one called? Lazing Around or something like that. It has a lovely name like that, where it's just him and Sissy. And again, it's a very elemental, you know, representation. It's not trying to be realistic. It's trying to sort of capture the idyllicness of where they were tucked away there on the Shearwater property. Let's see. And then, you know, their work keeps evolving. I love these two by Dusti and Archie, because as I was looking at stuff, I realized they were drawing the same vase, and he painted it and she drew it. It's the same vase with roughly the same flowers, probably from a slightly different angle. And you can see how she's really learning from him and literally sitting with him, trying to seriously hone her skills and become a painter, or, you know, at least to have that to do while she's raising Lyle and all of that. And meanwhile, Walter is creating just some amazing ceramics. But this piece is actually, I don't even know if it still exists or not. I've never seen it in person. I don't know if anybody here has or not, but I think it's just an absolutely fabulous work. So, you know, you have 3 genuine artists there, obviously. And then they also, all 3 of them, partly on their own schedules and probably partly together, again, continue with that interest in this sort of the coastal scenes with the boats and, you know, the rivers and the swamps and all of that. And the sketch on the left is by Dusti, and she's obviously learning very quickly from Archie. The one in the middle is by Archie. And then I just love the Walter Anderson sketch of him and Sissy on the river. I mean, talk about idyllic. And we all know that their life together was not always idyllic, so it's nice to find moments like this where you realize what an intimate relationship, however stressed it may have been at times, it was really, she meant the world to him, you know. And some more of those kinds of scenes, again, Dusti on the left, Archie in the middle, and Walter in a slightly different way on the right. What I think is interesting here is that as they're capturing these local scenes, Walter even uses these local scenes for his famous murals, with, on the one hand, you know, the current inhabitants of the coast, but also with the previous Native American inhabitants of the coast. But this This is all literally the oyster industry, okay? Those are the oyster shacks in Biloxi that Dusty and Archie were drawing and painting. And these are oyster nets they're pulling out. So it's just really remarkable. You see how they're all inspired by the same environment. They're inevitably all inspired by one another, but they all find their own way of representing it, you know. And Walter has this amazing, stylized, elegant, almost ballet-like way of showing these things. And Archie is trying to loosen up his very academic painting, and Dusty is just like, I'm doing my own thing here. And if you don't like it, too bad. But one thing that's very interesting to note here is that Walter was commissioned by Ellsworth Woodward to do this mural. And that's in part because back in the day when Annette McConnell was growing up, she went to Newcomb College and she met all these guys there. So she knew the Woodwards, and she knew probably George Ohr, and she knew Joseph Meyer. And so, you know, again, so she learned from them and indirectly brings it to her kids. Then her kids directly learn from it and get opportunities from it, right? So, but again, it also shows you that the Woodwards were really insistent on making sure that Southern artists really had a chance, you know, because doing murals back then was a big deal. It was a huge deal. You know, they had competitions for them, and it was during the WPA projects after the Depression to make sure that artists had a chance. And so the Woodwards made sure that arts in the South, that they had an equal chance. And Walter wound up doing a study for a mural for the courthouse in Jackson, I think, and he didn't win that one, and he was very disappointed. But anyway, so you know, they all have a few very happy years here, and then in 1936, Archie Bongé passes away at the age of 36, and Dusty, of course, is devastated, but in many ways, so is Walter. And then a year later, his father dies. So Walter is just crushed by losing, you know, the one artist friend that he was closest to, that he somebody he could really relate to, and then losing his father. So they throw themselves into their work, and Dusty starts painting full-time in the studio that was primarily used by Archie originally. And actually what you can see, the painting on the wall in the background is a painting that Archie had done. And then the painting on the easel is a painting that she's working on. It's kind of a miracle that we even have pictures like that, that she took the trouble to take a picture like that. And then, of course, you see Walter with one of his many beautiful creations that he keeps making at the pottery. And then, for a little while, a sort of a new connection emerges between Dusty and Shearwater and Walter. So Annette McConnell, in all her creative essence, decides that they should organize this sort of, not quite a salon, but sort of a gathering of local artists, and that they can all sit together and do designs that could be used on the pottery, because a lot of their pottery was also, you know, painted, especially the plates, with beautiful designs, and those are not really the ones you're intended to eat off of, but I'm sure you could. And so Dusty joins that circle of friends that start doing all these plate designs, and Walter does plate designs as well. I don't know how often he joins them in the group. And I think Joey Rice's grandmother joined, you know, there was just like a whole group of people. They were all doing that. But I love these two together because of the way, especially when you're doing plate designs, you have to somehow find a way to get something that's probably not circular in nature at all and somehow make it work in a circle. And here, both Dusti and Walter, Dusti basically makes that horse just sort of curl up as if he's, I'm not sure what he's doing. He may be bucking or he may be curled up and sleeping. And in Dusty's case, it's definitely the dog all curled up and sleeping. And it's like, okay, that's how you fit a dog into a plate. And then they both kind of have these decorative rims around them. And Dusti has little bunnies in the rim. And it's really cute. She calls this one a child's plate. And it says Tiger and His Dreams. And Tiger was their dog. So I think she had it in mind. She probably had her son in mind. And like, wouldn't that be a really cute plate for a kid to have? And so they both do plates, and there is one plate in the exhibit here that was a plate design that Dusti did that actually got turned into a plate. And I think we're all agreed on the fact that color-wise, it is definitely not a spectacular plate, but you should go see it. I do not have it in these slides, so, gives you an excuse to go look at the show again. But it has these kind of people all around, and we've come to call them the sausage people because they look kind of twisted, They're trying to dance or something, but they look like little twisted sausages. Anyway, some of her plate designs were much better, such as this lovely pelican, and of course, look at the lovely plate that Walter did back then. And Walter would usually do the painting on the plates, but Peter would do the plates and the final glazing. So, and then there's more, and then this one too, I love it. Walter's plate is like little goats prancing around, and Dusty's plate has little horses prancing around, And again, they take advantage of how you arrange these things in a circular pattern, which it takes to an interesting degree of abstracting, to be able to do that. Plus, they just turn out lovely. Dusti also tries her hand a little bit at clay. She didn't like throwing on the pot, but she liked to shape little sculptures. And I'm sure she was partly inspired here by Walter's work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Walter's horse figurines, and the famous one, Chesty horse. And I would say this horse is a little chesty, not as chesty as Walter's, but I think it's a lovely figurine. Most of Dusty's figurines are broken now, so this is one of the few that's still in shape. And then, of course, Walter does a fantastic cast for a horse and rider figurine, which is also a candle holder, which is just stunning. And then Dusti here has kind of a partial bust, which is sort of interesting, sort of twisted. And Walter here actually has, what is it? It's a legend with a man hugging a lion. What is it? Do you know, Megan? I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's right there. Yeah. Androcles and the lion, that's what it is. Yeah, so, and there too, here you see what a master at abstracting Walter is too, because these things are just fabulous. But, the little head, that's the human, and the big head, that's the lion that he somehow manages to hug. But, as they are doing this, they also still, both Walter and Dusti, really appreciate everything coastal. And so here we go back to Dusty walking around along the back bay, and this is a giant pile of oyster shells. They had the oyster shell piles in Biloxi were so high that they could be like 30, 40 feet high, and you could climb them. I'm sure it was a little painful to climb them because oyster shells can be very sharp, but that's what they did. And then eventually they would use the oyster shells for paving the roads. So some of us still find oyster shells in some of our neighborhoods. And you find them in your backyard, and, oyster shells in the middle of the grass. So, and this is part of a fabulous Biloxi beach scene, a linoleum block cut that Walter did. And here you start to see more and more his very stylized figures that he used a lot in his block prints with the, very well-defined muscles and strong profiles, and they're all marching. I don't know why they're marching on the beach, but and then I think there are, of course, birds in the sky, and then there's the young lady, and I don't think at the time they dressed like that anymore to swim, because there's also a few girls with bikinis, but so she must have just been dressed going for a walk. But back in the day, they did wear those horrifying dresses to go to the beach. A dress to go to the beach was more dressy than an evening gown is nowadays. So, but it's also interesting because at this point, we're getting to the war years, and so everything in both Dusty's life and Walter's life is changing a little bit, and Walter winds up moving with Sissy and the kids. They moved to Oldfields, which was the house of Sissy's parents in Goche, Mississippi, and Dusty stays in Biloxi, but back then you didn't have the Biloxi Ocean Springs Bridge, so I'm sure they saw a lot less of each other because they were, back then, even if you had a car, that would be a hike, because you couldn't set it on co-pilot and let it drive you. And this is the time where Walter is kind of elated because they're working in the pottery lathe, and he has lots of time to do all these linoleum block cuts, and he makes all these linoleum blocks, and he really wants them to serve as a way to make art available to everybody, because if you have a carved linoleum block, you can make as many prints as you want. And then he would hand color the prints like he did in this one. And granted, I'm sorry, some of these photos are not the greatest quality photos, but he would print them, and then he would quickly color them with some watercolor to just sort of accent details so that you kind of knew what was going on, like the blonde hair on the lady and the black hair on the guys and their blue swimsuits and her red dress. Yes? What exactly is a linoleum block? Oh, okay. So there's linoleum is this sort of resilient, rubbery material. It's not rubber, like a linoleum floor. Yeah. So what he did was he would carve out into the linoleum, like the way you might do a wood carving that you would then print. He would use the linoleum because it's a lot softer. And what was really special about him is in order to keep it inexpensive, because it's the war years, he would back then they often used rolls of linoleum for flooring in ships. And those rolls, they were always, I think, 18 inches or something like that, just these big rolls, and it was thick linoleum, so you could really carve into it. And he would carve the whole thing, and then he would get some more recycled stuff, which would be discontinued wallpaper rolls. And back then, wallpaper was applied with you had to put glue on, and the paper was just paper. So he would turn the paper over so that the pattern was completely immaterial to him, and he would lay the wood block down, and he would roll ink over it, and then he would lay the paper on it and roll it again with a very heavy roller. I'm not sure what he used, so that he could press the ink onto the paper, and then he would take that, and that was the linoleum block print. So, and those, because he could mass produce them, he thought, this is the kind of thing you could even buy art for your kids. And so a lot of his linoleum blocks, their topics were fairy tales, or Androcles and the lion, or Leda and the swan, or whatever, the cow that jumped over the moon. All that just these wonderful youth-oriented things, which I'm sure, being there at Oldfields with his own young daughter at the time, and I don't know if Billy was born yet. He was? Yeah. So he had little kids. What better to do than to make art that kids could enjoy? So he did quite a few of those. Meanwhile, Dusti keeps doing a lot of those local scenes, and this is factory building, and then a boat in the foreground, and we think the yellow part is a shrimp net hanging to dry. But for some reason, when somebody saw this painting years ago and didn't realize what it was a painting of, they decided that the yellow things were bananas. So the title of the painting is Bananas, when there were no bananas inside. But I think that's kind of funny. And the circular things has something to do with the steam pipes they used to steam the oysters that then would get canned and sent all across the country. And then Walter continues with his fabulous linoleum blocks, and this one's called Animals 2x2, and it's all the animals that are going to go to Noah's Ark, which is just lovely. So on the top you see the zebras and the camels. On the bottom, you have the elephants and lions and giraffes, and it's just really lovely. But again, that stylized form making, that's basically, I think it's appealing to anybody and everybody. And this is where I think it's very interesting, because they start to diverge. Dusti really starts doing things the way she wants to do them, and not everybody gets it. Walter's stuff is just, it's incredibly creative, but it's so graphically alluring. It's hard for somebody not to like it. It just, it's even hard to stay neutral to it. It's just, it's compelling, It's friendly and engaging and all of that. And Dusty's is more like, you really have to look and wait, what is she doing there? I'm not sure what that is. Are those bananas? No, they're not. But while they are doing this, and this is, the war years now, they both start spending more time in New Orleans again, too, which I think is kind of interesting, because they both have their Louisiana roots and all of that. And so here you have a quick sketch. This is from a sketchbook. Dusti would take a sketchbook, and she would sometimes sketch the same set of buildings at a particular angle that she thought was interesting, and she would sketch it 5 times in a row. So she did numerous of these sketches. Meanwhile, Walter takes a bike ride to New Orleans, which must have been quite a hike. And he starts studying, how all the people move in New Orleans. So Dusti is focused on the buildings, and Walter is focused on the people. And he starts to, when we say he, in addition to doing the linoleum blocks at Oldfields, he also did murals at Oldfields. What he really did was, he was not allowed to paint on the walls by his father-in-law. So he would take the big newsprint size sheets, the 26 by whatever it is, 15 or 18, the big newsprint pads, that type of stuff. And he would pin all the walls with all that paper, and that's how he would create his murals. So each piece of paper had a section of mural on it. And so he did a New Orleans mural. He did an Old Fields mural. He did I don't know. He many murals, and luckily there's still quite a few of them left even after Hurricane Katrina, and it's wonderful when you see them all together. And in a way, an advantage, because if they had been painted on the walls there, I'm sure by now somebody else would have painted over them. Because at one point that house at Oldfields really fell into disrepair. They're doing everything now to bring it back again. Yeah. Right. Oh, good. But it was in serious disrepair, and I was a bad girl once, and I snuck in there when you're not really supposed to, because nobody was living there, and it had been occupied for a while. There was a weird giant house going up next to it that never got finished. This enormous. Oh, Jesus. It's massive, and it had this sort of Al Capone, say hello to my little friend quality to it. It was terrifying, just this enormous house. But these people had lived in Oldfields. And so when I went there, when it was all in disarray, it looked like they had moved really quickly. So I think it really was a mafia family. I totally don't know. I just think this is pure gossip, but it's, gossip is part of what keeps the world go around. And sometimes gossip is based in something. There's a lot of mafia here on the coast throughout the years. So it's very possible. Yeah, it's this. Oh, okay. So it's not a mafia. Oh, okay, good. No mafia. That was just such a good story. Yeah. But it was, it's just like, okay. But it looked like they were not going to do anything with Oldfields anymore, because that was all the same property. They were building this humongous house, but.
And I will say they were nice enough, so me and Maddie went over, because this was during when we were working on the Return to Oldfields exhibition. The cemetery for Oldfields is actually just across their yard.
Right.
And they let us go into it.
Okay, good.
So they did allow us onto their property.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Well, good. But anyway, so enough with my gossip, and back to New Orleans. So, they start making connections again to New Orleans after the war years, as the war years are passing. And Dusti continues drawing her buildings at her acute, weird cubist angles, and Walter is studying his people walking, and with the buildings in the background. And look at how different, too, they look at the buildings, right? I mean, Walter represents a building with a few marks that are very elegant and gets the ornateness of it. And Dusti is like, oh, I see repetition here. And then, more of the same. And this one is interesting because I told you earlier that Dusti would often sketch something multiple times. She sketched this building multiple times, and then she did a painting of it. And the painting is in the exhibit. And I'll show it to you in just a sec. And Walter now has people and cars. And he also, himself, does this very weird perspective stuff. Because when you look at it this way, it looks like he's floating in the air looking down at them, right? And Dusti kind of does a similar thing. So they really observe what's going on, but they don't immerse themselves in it. They are onlookers, and then they represent it. I'm not saying that they weren't emotionally immersed in it, but the way they represent it is kind of at a distance, and sometimes in Dusty's case it feels even more distant because she doesn't include people at all. And I'm quite sure that that little street she was sketching probably eventually had somebody walk by. But then you'll see when we go to the next slide, that's a painting of the same drawing. I'll go back for a sec. I mean, obviously it changes a bit, but you see the red building and the tall red building and the curly Q gray stuff in front of it. That's sort of the very fine ironwork porches. And then you go to the next one, and the ironwork porch has been rendered white, which is kind of interesting. But you still have the tall red building and the smaller white building, and it has more sort of delicate curls on it as well. And Walter here has several ladies walking with one gentleman. And these are just fabulous. And then here's an example of how Dusty would sketch the same building over and over and over again. And you're like, wait, how is that a building? What's she doing here? Meanwhile, over here for Walter, it's really interesting to see how he did a little sketch of what he wanted the entire New Orleans mural to look like. So he's dividing it up over here, one piece, and we saw that piece that he drew with the gentleman and the cars, and then you have the middle piece where you have the women walking, and then you have the lower middle piece with mostly cars, and then you have another piece with mostly people. So these were all going to be individual sheets. That's how he's laying it out so that then eventually he can do all the drawings. So he makes the pattern, then he does all the drawings, and then he starts to watercolor them. So, and this is, I'm sorry, it's a very bad slide. I didn't mean to do that, but I couldn't find a good image of it. And this, by Dusty, that is a painting of the building she sketched 4 times there. It's a little hard to recognize, but you'll see the volumes and the weird angular roofs, and again, the very ornate iron porches. And you go back here, and you see all the angular roofs and the weird sort of scrolly dark blue stuff is the iron porches. This painting is also very strange because it had a lot of damage, so it was a little difficult to, when it got restored, to reconstruct it. It had so many layers on it, that it's, I think it still feels like it's different layers are popping through. But it makes for a fascinating and very colorful piece. So, okay, so now, eventually, I think, I'm not saying the friendship between Walter and Sissy and Dusty ever ended, but, your lives change, things start happening, and Dusty, at one point, she is lucky enough that she actually, I think, had a small place in New Orleans, so she can stay there for more extended periods of time. And so she reconnects with Paul Ninas, who was her husband's friend. And Paul Ninas at the time had, I think him and his wife had divorced. So they kind of had a camaraderie because they had both lost their loved ones in a way. But she also starts to make some other very interesting and weird friends. And again, these people also, they come from all over. Remember, the Woodwards came from Massachusetts, and Paul Ninas came via Nebraska to New Orleans. And, it's just amazing what a magnet New Orleans ultimately winds up being for so many artists. And here you have two people, Hazel Guggenheim McKinley and Larry Bornstein. And Hazel Guggenheim is Peggy Guggenheim's younger sister. And the Guggenheims of Guggenheim Museum fame, the Solomon Guggenheim Museum, that Solomon Guggenheim was their uncle. Their father died in the Titanic. So, and this is not gossip, this is true. So there's just, what a wild life, and then Peggy becomes this major collector and she helps her uncle collect endlessly, so they open a museum. But meanwhile, her younger, crazier sister, Hazel, winds up in her lifetime, I think she got married 6 or 7 times, and lived in New York, and then lived in England, and then lived in New Orleans, and then lived somewhere else, and then came back to New Orleans, and then lived somewhere else, and then came back to New Orleans, and whatever. But they befriended each other because there was the older New York connection, and of course, Dusti had lived in New York with Archie for quite a few years, and Walter had lived in New York. I don't know if he knew Hazel or not, but so Dusti and Hazel become friends. And meanwhile, a few years later, Dusti also becomes friends with Larry Bornstein. Now, this is not quite in the same time period, but these are two characters from New Orleans, okay? They are well known in New Orleans.
I knew Hazel.
You knew Hazel? Wasn't she nutty?
Crazy.
Yeah.
I probably can't repeat.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I've heard a few stories too where I'm like, all righty then. So she was quite nutty, but very creative. And Hazel painted, and she's actually considered a New Orleans artist because she did most of her painting there. That was her community there. Larry was not an artist. Larry was he did everything. He basically wound up becoming a major real estate owner in New Orleans, but moved there during the war, and I can't remember why. I don't know if he went to do a story on something, but likes New Orleans and stays there. And initially he opens an art gallery, and it doesn't do very well, so he closes it. Then he opens another art gallery. And, he of course shows local people, and we have a painting by Dusti that still has a label on the back that says E. Lawrence Bornstein Gallery, and it was like from the 1940s. So I'm sure many of them showed there. Anyway, so Hazel paints, and Larry has the brilliant idea. He's like, okay, art galleries just don't get a lot of foot traffic. I think what I am going to do is I'm going to start recruiting jazz musicians to come play at my gallery. And so he did, and all of a sudden the gallery gets a lot more attendance, right? Because there's these great jam sessions going on. I mean, what's greater than a good jazz jam session? So you see him here with some of the local characters, and he's actually pouring them drinks, and it becomes a whole. Yes, there's art, but it becomes Mr. Larry's Gallery. Everybody calls it Mr. Larry's Gallery, and Mr. Larry's Gallery eventually becomes what is now Preservation Hall. And if any of you have never been to Preservation Hall, you must go. It is the best New Orleans authentic jazz music you will ever hear. They don't serve drinks. They don't serve food. You can't smoke. You can bring your own bottle in, and then they don't care if you bring in wine or whatever, but they're not going to give you cups. You're only there for the music. It's astounding. And they basically have jam sessions, and you get to sit for 1 or 2 sessions. They they herd you in along the side of the building, and you have to sit in the back first. And there's a whole group of people sitting in the front, and then the group in the front leaves. You get to come to the front, and a new group of people comes in the back. And these are like the best. A lot of them are black jazz musicians, but every once in a while there's a Caucasian man among them. And oh my God, it's the next best thing to Louis Armstrong. It's amazing. So if you haven't been, shame on you. No, not really, but it really, really, really is worth it. And so that literally grew out of Larry inviting all these artists to come to his gallery. And eventually it was like, okay, forget the gallery part, let's just do music. And then another couple years later bought it and officially called it Preservation Hall and all of that. And that finally, I think that happened in the 50s. But so Larry is known as the father of Preservation Hall, and Hazel and Dusty and all kinds of people showed their work there. And the whole place is still full of paintings, because a lot of paintings wound up being the artists coming there and painting the jazz musicians. So it's just this wonderful mix of music and artists all coming together. But they were such good friends of Dusty's that Dusty did portraits of both of them. So that's a portrait of Hazel. She always, she often had flowers in her hair, and she wore really busy clothing as if she was ready for a performance or something. And Larry was a short, stout little man who would, sit around and read and smoke and whatever. But they were good friends. And actually, for a while, I think Dusty and Larry were in a relationship, which is kind of interesting because he was easily 15 years younger than her. And she was tall and he was not. So they obviously liked each other for their minds, and, they had a true friendship. Okay, and then there's yet another group of friends. Now we're moving into the 50s. And there were some artists this is a next generation of artists. So Dusty and Hazel and Walter and Paul Ninas, they were all from around the 1900s. And then you get the whole range of people that were born around the 1920s. So by now in the 1950s, these are all 20-something-year-olds, but Dusty meets them all because they're all artists. And she was always very much friends, in all directions. Doesn't matter how old or how young you are. And 3 of these friends were George Dunbar. He was from New Orleans. Robert Helmer, he was from Michigan. And Jack Robinson, he was from Meridian, Mississippi. And George Dunbar was a painter. He recently passed away, and I think he's very well known in New Orleans. Robert Helmer was a painter, and Jack Robinson initially did some art, but became ultimately a very famous photographer. And so Dusty meets all these people there, all 3 of them, and George Dunbar, together with Robert Helmer, they start something in, I think, in 1952 or 53. That's called the Chart Street School, and it's an art school. It's an art studio where people can go take classes, and it was on the 2nd floor above a furniture store, I think. Anyway, and they started mainly because they're all young, and they want that camaraderie of these guys had, George and Bob had actually studied art, and so they wanted to share that. And I've done that even here in Ocean Springs, and people still do it in Ocean Springs. You want to have live drawing studios where you get a model, where you can keep doing this work, because you have to always do it. If you don't keep doing it, you lose your touch, So So they offered art studio classes there. And Dusti starts taking classes there, which is very interesting because now we're, in the early mid-50s. She's been painting for over 15 years. And she realizes you're never, you have to keep learning, and you have to keep exposing yourself to other artists. The photos are George Dunbar, who was one of the founders, in the studio in the back. And then a long view of the studio, and you see them all sitting there, and there's a nude model in the background that they are all drawing or painting. And then a photo of Dusti sitting behind one of her paintings in the studio there. And all of these photos were taken by Jack Robinson. And so again, the circle just keeps, spiraling up and gets more complicated and gets smaller and gets larger again. But Jack Robinson initially also took classes at the Chart Street School. So that's how Dusti met him. And then, so they're all taking art classes there. And so this is George Dunbar's style of painting. He was an abstract painter. Robert Helmer was an abstract painter. And of course, Dusti wound up, at that time, had already started painting abstract. So she found a great, sense of camaraderie with them. And they were kind of the next generation, just like the Woodwards back in the beginning really wanted to bring the fine arts to New Orleans and the coast and put the South on the map in the art world. George Dunbar and Robert Helmer really wanted to bring mid-century modern art to New Orleans and put it on the map. And, because now, of course, you had all the sort of the tentacles of the Woodwards. There are all these great painters in New Orleans, but they all do landscapes and things like that. So now these guys are like, no, we're the next generation. We want something new. So they paint very differently and really paint the way, the stuff that was going on the West Coast and the East Coast. So they bring that to New Orleans. And meanwhile, Jack Robinson starts photographing and photographing and photographing more. And this is, I think, a fabulous shot of a room of an old hacienda in Mexico. And it just so happens that Dusti, at one point, goes on a trip to Mexico with Jack Robinson and Jack Robinson's lover, and with her friend Betty Parsons, who was a gallery owner in New York. And Dusti was actually the one who brought Betty Parsons to New Orleans and basically said, there's some cool art here, too. So, alliances. Here's some more pictures, painting by George Dunbar and Robert Helmer. And here you see, yes, Jack Robinson is getting famous. That's a little girl named Liza Minnelli. He was at a party shooting her. He wound up shooting Jack Nicholson and Joni Mitchell, and I mean, you name it. Famous people. And basically, when he meets Betty Parsons, and they all go on their trip to Mexico, and they all have a great time, he takes fabulous pictures of them over there, too. But Betty Parsons says to him, you're really good. You should come to New York. I can hook you up, She did offered the same to Dusti. Said, you should come back to New York and I can really hook you up. But Dusti went for a few months and she was like, no, I don't want it anymore. I like it on the coast. It's much more peaceful, and the colors are more vibrant and all of that. But Jack Robinson goes, and that's where he gets he photographs for Vogue, and I mean, yeah, he had it made. But I just love the fact that he had a photograph of Liza Minnelli with her then husband. You don't really get into parties like that unless you're already a little bit somebody, I think. So those are some of the young connections Dusty then makes in New Orleans. And ultimately, Walter again makes it back to New Orleans too, and starts doing a whole series of Mardi Gras paintings, while Dusty is still doing her live drawing, studio drawings with at the Chartres School. Walter takes another one of his trips. I don't know if he went on a bike this time or if he drove, but he goes and he does street scenes, but they are during Mardi Gras. So, this is like, I think some of this is like big float stuff. And I love how all of the ones that he did, they all wound up having some color in them, but not completely. And it's almost like that makes them stronger. Like if he had colored everything in, it would have just been perhaps overwhelming. But you also see here that Dusty is really taking on that. Remember the little baby Lyle she drew? She obviously has improved since then. And this is these are gesture drawing studies where you literally the model sits for about 1 minute and you capture it with a very quick gesture. And the point is that you look at the model as much as possible and you look at your paper as little as possible and you try to capture what's there, to just really give you a sense that you learn how to look at the scale and the proportions, and you can capture them with your hand. So you're working your eye-hand coordination. And they always make for very interesting things, because obviously, her butt looks a little funny there, but you get the point. You immediately understand the pose. The woman is leaning, her feet kind of folded over. So here's another one. This is a gentleman sitting on a stool, which in turn is on a small podium. And you can see she does the drawing and his head doesn't quite fit because you're taking all of 1 minute to do it. And here again, you have a lovely New Orleans float that Walter Anderson painted. And then we have some more. And then this one is great. I love this one. This brings Dusty back again to Larry's gallery, Mr. Larry's gallery, where the jazz musicians are. And she brings her sketchbook and she starts doing gesture drawings of the people that are dancing there and playing there. So I just love this one. It's just, you can just tell that woman is having a great old time dancing. And I'm pretty sure that on Walter's side, the revelers are having a great old time dancing as well. And there's probably a lot of jazz music all around. And then here's another one. Here she has the jazz musicians, which I just think looks fabulous. I mean, look at the curve of the bow and that bass. She totally gets it. It's like, and the sort of the relaxed pose with which they're standing. And then Walter with the people waving at the floats and, just very joyous. And it's kind of wonderful to see pieces like this because, they both had hard and at times tragic lives. They had a lot of hardships to overcome. She, was widowed so young. Walter lost his friend. Walter had episodes where he, had to go to Whitfield or to other psychiatric institutions. So you realize that with all their personal struggles, artists are the luckiest people because their art allows them to overcome it and work through it, Maybe they don't always overcome it, but they can at least work through it, and they can find joyous things that really give them satisfaction, and luckily give us satisfaction too. And then I'm coming to my final slide because I'm sure you're all yawning by now. Ultimately, it's interesting to me to see that these two friends who were doing plate designs together wind up pursuing art forms that are so completely different. You know, eventually, I think Dusty starts spending less time in New Orleans, as does Walter. Walter starts to go to Horn Island more and more and more in the 1950s in his tiny rowboat and spending weeks at a time there. And Dusty spends a good bit of time in New York, back and forth. She never lived there again, but and shows her work in New York, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, look at the contrast there between starting off with the same friends, the same influences, the same inspiration, the coastal inspiration, the Paul Nina's inspiration, the Woodwards inspiration, and look where they both wind up. It's pretty amazing. But then I also noticed something very interesting, that the setup of these paintings is very similar. Structurally, compositionally, with the light at the center, the dark verticals, and a few horizontals that, in Dusty's case, none of them mean anything, but are they indirectly inspired by her love of the coast? I'm sure they are. So, but I guess all I would say now is we're lucky that they were here and that we get to enjoy their work. So, thank you.